Good afternoon, everybody. Making sure I'm giving everybody that's here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today we are going to finish our lecture on just the intro part of Psych. Yes, good afternoon. Yes, please feel free to use the chat to sort of chat with each other as well as me. So we will finish our PowerPoint, and then I actually have a group not really assignment group project for you guys to do in class today. Won't take very long, but to learn about the different careers in psychology, which we'll cover a little bit, but you all will fill us in about even more. So when we get to that point, I will explain everything. But the way that we're going to start is by just finishing up our PowerPoint from last Wednesday. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we will go from there. Okay, so we're talking about behaviorism. So we had just talked about good old Freud. I always talk about Freud. My Theories of Personality class is just getting ready to talk about him for weeks. So we certainly talk a lot about him in our classes. So in terms of behaviorism, we're going to start by talking about John Watson. And I'm just pulling up my chat so I can see y'all in my participant screen. There we go. Okay. So John Watson was American, and he founded the Behavioral School of Thought along with several other folks that we'll touch on here as well. And the basic tenet of behaviorism is that only observable behavior should be studied. So behavior is just overt or observable responses, and they thought that this was the only thing that should be studied. They said that anything else that happened inside the mind didn't matter. Obviously, we would disagree with that today, but that is something that they strongly believed. And this was not just people, this was any organism, so it could be any animal as well. Watson's ideas radically changed the landscape of psychology. So psychology became the scientific study of behavior, largely because of Watson's efforts and those of the other behaviorists. So this really was a radical reorientation of psychology, because again, before this point, we've been thinking about what is the structure of the mind? What is the function of the mind? We've been thinking about Freud and what are all these unconscious urges, right? So Watson said, again, it doesn't matter what's happening in the mind. We should just study just things we can observe. So let's forget about consciousness and unconscious. So Watson is a huge name in the nature-nurture debate here. So he really believed in nurture, and he took a strong stand. Who are we? And he said it's because of what we are taught. So this is actually a quote he said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own special world to bring them up in. And I guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I may select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, worship chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief." So he really thought that everyone just learned everything. He said that essentially this was all taught, that it didn't matter what you were born. So we were emphasizing the environment, nurture. So then we get to Skinner, who's another behaviorist. And he was another American behaviorist. And he championed a return to the strict focus on observable behavior only, just like Watson. He didn't deny that mental events exist, just that they can be studied scientifically. Just that he said mental events can't be studied scientifically, so therefore they're outside the realm of the science of psychology. And psychology wants to be a science; it should act like any of the other sciences. And the fundamental principle is that organisms tend to repeat responses that lead to positive outcomes and vice versa. And we'll talk a lot more about this. Thanks for telling me, Elijah, that I sound muffled. I'm going to try moving closer to the screen and seeing if that helps and move things away from my microphone. So, see if that helps, and I'll try to speak more clearly as well. So Skinner said that we should study essentially how the outcomes of our behaviors influence what we do. And when we get to the learning chapter, we're going to talk a lot about this. We're going to talk a lot about reinforcement and punishment and how you get something to, or someone to keep doing what they're doing and how you get them to stop, okay? Skinner was really the person who looked into this. He trained animals in these principles with a lot of success. So he did a lot of experiments with rats and with pigeons. So that was a huge thing as well. And later, his followers started expanding this out to humans. I'm also going to try turning my fan off and see if that helps with the clarity of my audio as well. And so he said, let's look at this in animals. Later, people said we can do it with humans too. Just look at observable behavior. He also stirred up controversy in the 1970s when he published this book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. So he basically asserted that all behavior is governed by external stimuli and that people are controlled by their environments, not by themselves. He thought that free will was an illusion. Responses that lead to positive outcomes are repeated. Responses that lead to negative outcomes are not repeated. Obviously, this is really controversial because no one likes to be told they don't have free will, that they don't get to make their own choices. Right? So I just got a question if we were going to talk about the Stanford prison experiments. Actually, if you take 102, we cover that in 102 when we talk about social psych. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm still muffled. I'm not really sure what's going on, but I'll just keep standing a little closer. I can actually adjust my camera up so I don't have to bend awkwardly. I think part of the problem is that it's processing the video from my last class. So I will just try to be more clear. But yes, you're interested in stuff like the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram Experiment, we cover that in Psych 102. And this semester is a lot more of the biopsyche stuff, development, thinking, learning, all that kind of fun stuff. Great questions. So for anyone that I am still muffled for, I will post this to YouTube after class, and YouTube automatically puts captions on things. So I will make sure that the captions get on there and that you can review any part that isn't clear. But please ask any clarifying questions in the chat if there's anything in particular that you can't make out. This is the joy of technology, right? Woohoo! So in the 1950s, we had people just say, look, psychoanalytic theory isn't great, but neither is behaviorism. Neither of these things are great. So we just really don't want either of them. And so they were like, what could we do instead? What should we be looking at? So a new school of thought emerged, and this was humanism. And so they were, again, sort of like anti-Freud and Skinner, but they thought the behaviorists went too far. And this was led by American psychologists Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Humanism focused on the unique qualities of humans, especially free will and the potential for personal growth. It's a very optimistic view of human nature, as opposed to, again, this idea that like people don't have free will that we were getting from Skinner, or this like you're just stuck because of stuff that happened in your past or is in your unconscious that you're getting from psychoanalysis. So they were really interested in thinking about mental processes, and they really emphasized the unique qualities of humans, freedom and personal growth. And in the modern day field of counseling psychology really particularly emphasizes this perspective and really uses the humanistic, or sometimes called person-centered perspective, as a guiding principle. So before World War II, there were very few clinical psychologists. So as we talked about before, Freud himself was a neurologist. He had an MD. So in terms of people with a PhD in psychology, they tended to be people who were in labs, teaching at universities, doing research. But during and after World War II, there was a huge need for psychologists to evaluate and treat servicemen. And believe it or not, there were women on the front at those times as well, working as nurses, etc. Academic psychologists started to be pressed into service to help evaluate service people and also treat them. So in terms of evaluating, this is, we actually came up with exams to see if people were qualified to be soldiers. And then after the war, continuing treatment for veterans required more clinical psychologists. And the Veterans Administration, the VA, funded many new training programs in clinical psychology. As a result, in a few years, half the new PhDs in psychology were clinical psychologists. And that statistic maintains till this day, that over half the PhDs given in psychology are to sort of what we consider to be applied fields like clinical psychology. So we really started to come together as a profession to realize we had something to give in terms of assessing people and also treating them for things. Oh, and I actually have to say, we have to, all new PhDs were clinical psychologists. And then sort of simultaneous with that, people got a renewed interest in physiology and cognition. So cognition is the mental process involved in acquiring knowledge, or the mental processes. There's more than one mental process. It's the application of scientific methods to studying internal mental events. So cognitions involve things like thinking, conscious experience, learning, memory. We'll do a whole chapter, actually, we're gonna have several chapters about cognition, to be honest, this semester. The dominance of behaviorist thought started decreasing at this time with cognitive psychology. And there were theorists like Jean Piaget, who studied development of cognition, Noam Chomsky, who studied the psychological underpinnings of language, and Herbert Simon, who studied problem solving. And these folks paved the new path in psychology by using scientific methods to study how we think. So now we're getting rid of that idea that the brain's a black box, we don't care about what goes on in the brain, starting to talk about the brain again and what goes on in our mind. At the same time, there were important findings in biological psychology. And this tries to explain behavior in terms of physiological processes, most particularly in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. So James Olds in the 1950s demonstrated that animals could be made to experience emotions like pleasure and rage by stimulating their brains. And Roger Sperry in the 1980s demonstrated that the left and right halves of the brain have some specialized functions and might handle different mental tasks, although it's not quite as specialized as we initially said. So you've often heard, oh, that person's right brain, left brain. I mean, we also use both half of our brains if we have them, right? Okay, so that gives you a really, really broad surface level overview of the history of psychology in the past 100, 150 years. What I'm going to start talking about now is thinking about how does psychology work? What do people do who are psychologists? And I'm going to start by going over areas of psychological research. So a lot of people with PhDs in psychology will actually focus on doing research. So their day-to-day life is actually spent in the lab, setting up studies, working with animals or people to study these things and contribute to our scientific knowledge about these things. So physiological psychology, sometimes this is also referred to as biopsychology, is the physiology of behavior, the nervous system, the hormones. So behavior, the nervous system, hormones. These are the folks who are looking at the brain. Oh, Lara, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
You said that we were going to talk about, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
You said we were going to talk about the many professions that come with psychology. How many are there?
I don't have a number because in addition to like subfields of psychology, of which there are many, there are a lot of professions that you can do with a degree in psychology that like even go beyond being called a psychologist or something. So I don't know that I have a number, a lot.
So are we just going to go over the basic ones or the most common ones?
Yeah. So we're kind of starting now talking about the areas of research that people do. And then our next slide, we'll talk about some of the most popular ones. And then when you all do your group activity today, you're going to sort of branch beyond that and tell us even more about some of them. Great.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Related to physiological psych is psychophysiology, and that's measurement of people's physiological reactions. So things like heart rate, skin conductance, how much you're sweating. It does things, we do things now like measuring cortisol levels, so things along those lines. Comparative psychology is the study of behavior in animals. And it's called comparative because we are often comparing the animals to humans. So how do the animals compare with the humans? Behavioral analysis is looking at the effect of the environment on the behavior. There's also a degree you can do. It's really a certification called Applied Behavioral Analysis. where you apply these principles often to people who are neurodiverse, people with autism spectrum disorders, for example. Behavioral genetics is a newer subfield. It looks at the role of our genes, our DNA, in our behavior. And this we're often starting at the animal level, but we've certainly started to branch out to humans. So for example, I was a control for a large scale study. I think they collected DNA from 20,000 people now, looking at what might be the genetic factors in anorexia nervosa. Cognitive psychology is looking at mental processes and complex behaviors, so things like attention and memory. We have a cognitive psychologist in our department, Dr. Ariel. So if this is something that is particularly of interest to you, please feel free to chat with him about his field. We'd love to talk with you about it. Experimental neuropsychology looks at what brain mechanisms are responsible for essentially what cognitive psychology looks like. So it's essentially saying what's happening in the brain when we think, when we're paying attention, when we're trying to remember things. And a lot of times we do that by studying people who've had brain injuries, because we can look at where the injury is in the brain and then what problems are they having with function. Developmental psychology looks at physical, cognitive, emotional, and social development. We tend to think of this only in kids, but in fact, developmental psychologists look at the entire lifespan. Our developmental psychologist is Dr. Martorell, and she teaches a whole sequence of courses. In addition to lifespan, she teaches infant, child, adolescence development, and then adult development and aging. So there are 4 different courses you can take in our department in developmental psychology. Social psychologists look at the effects of people on other people. Dr. Jackson is our social psychologist, and he has actually done some really cool research about things like how people make predictions about sporting events, for example. Personality psychology, it looks at individual differences in temperaments and patterns of behavior. Cross-cultural psychology is going to look at the impact of culture on behavior, or subculture on behavior. And then I am our clinical psychologist. And clinical psychologists who do research, like I do, focus on the study of mental disorders and problems with adjustment. So causes, prevention, treatment. So mine in particular, my research looks at risk factors for body image disturbance and disordered eating, but also protective factors. And I've moved to start to do very brief prevention or interventions for those as well. So those are just areas where you do research. So most of these people would be in academic settings, working at a university or a college, teaching as well as performing their research. However, there are jobs available for many of these in industry now as well. So for example, people at Facebook, might be people who are trained as psychologists and can use their information they know about human behavior to help build better algorithms. All right, now what we tend to think of when we think of psychology jobs is actually applied psychology. So these are people who are working directly with other people. We typically call these folks clients that can benefit from their services. So you can be an applied clinical psychologist, and this is people who treat and assess disorders. They might work in private practice, they might work in a hospital setting, government services like the VA. Yeah, Lara, go ahead.
Are any of these things we're going to need to know on a future test, or?
If I say anything, just assume it might be on a test. So anything I say. We will do a review before each of our tests, and you will also get a review sheet to guide your studying. That's a really good question. Yeah, pretty much anything I cover, assume it could be on a test. Let's see. So clinical psychologists also work in places like, as professors, but they might also work for different organizations. So for example, places that specifically need to screen their employees for mental disorders before they employ them. Clinical neuropsychology is a more specific version. It's basically the applied form of biopsychology, psychophysiology. So you identify and treat the consequences of disorders of the nervous system, brain injuries, things along those lines. So clinical neuropsychologists might work with people with dementia. They might work with folks who have learning disabilities, memory issues, things along those lines. A lot of their job is actually assessment of these issues. Where is that person lacking in order to then come up with a treatment plan? Health psychologists promote behavior and lifestyles that maintain health and try to prevent illness. It's also the interaction between physical and mental health problems. A lot of health psychologists will work in hospital settings. More and more, they're also starting to be integrated into private practice settings. So a primary care office might have a psychologist so that if you're having a problem, they just walk you down the hall. And you don't have to set up a separate appointment. So I did some health psychology work while I was in graduate school, and I did things like rounds in the hospital, seeing people who came in with drugs or alcohol in their system, people who came in after suicide attempts. I worked with people with spinal cord injuries, a blind rehab unit. I worked with folks who had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. I worked with people with muscular sclerosis, and I worked in an HIV/AIDS clinic. So lots of varied settings, varied things that can apply here. School psychology tends to focus on K through 12 kids, behavioral problems, learning disabilities. A lot of school psychologists' time, like clinical neuropsychologists, is spent actually doing assessment, figuring out if kiddos need, an IEP, a plan to get some help, additional time, and for tests, things like that. School psychologists, depending on the resources of the district, may be very thinly stretched. I know a school psychologist from the western side of Virginia, and she's in charge of an entire county. So all the schools in that county, she has to rotate with. Whereas in a richer district, they might have one school psychologist per school. Consumer psychology are people who help in advertising and product development. So this is not something a lot of people think of, but you can make good money doing this. Businesses love psychologists because we know kind of all the little tips and tricks to get people to think about things, like things along those lines. Community psychologists look at welfare of individuals in the social system and try to improve the system. So they're doing a lot of work on prevention, public health, essentially. And so they'll work on sort of a larger level of trying to implement things. If you want to make a lot of money as a psychologist, an industrial organizational psychologist is the person to do. They can make 1.5 to 2 times more than a clinical psychologist. And essentially what these folks do is they work in businesses to try to improve the efficiency, the happiness of the employees, things along those lines. So sometimes they're doing research to sort of help companies keep their employees the most motivated and on task. Sometimes they're someone that the employees come to when they have issues and help them work with things like anger management. But because they're in business where the money is, they tend to be paid the best. When we found out about this in grad school, we all kind of jokingly said, okay, we quit, we're gonna go be IO psychologists. None of us actually did, but they are where you make the money as a psychologist. Then there's also engineering psychology, which is called human systems or human factors. So these folks do things like work for Fitbit, right? How do you interact technology with a human? They might do things like work on helping people adjust to prosthetic limbs, things along those lines. Sort of technology person interaction. So very cool things that you can do doing this. So this is the employment of psychologists by setting. This is an older pie chart, but it hasn't changed much, honestly. So as you can see, there are a big chunk, about a third of psychologists work in private practice, but another almost 30% work at colleges and universities, like myself. So the audio keeps going in and out. The video is also freezing, and it's fine on my end. I don't know if other people are experiencing that as well. We might be having some internet issues either here or on campus. So again, if you need clarification, please just ask a specific question in the chat and I will answer it for you. But I'll repeat what I just said. So private practice is about a third of psychologists. 28% of psychologists work at colleges and universities. And then we have them in school settings, hospitals and clinics, businesses and governments, and then miscellaneous. All right, so it's cutting out for a couple of you all. So I'm gonna try something really quick. I'm gonna sign off of Zoom and sign back on to see if that fixes the problem. So I'm gonna stop share real quick, and I promise I will be right back.